Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Tzouvala, and I'll be chairing this panel. It is a very great honor to be introducing this morning's speakers. Before I do so, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting here today on the unceded lands of the Navajo and Ngambri people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. All the way from Oxford, we are being joined by Professor Sam Moyn. Professor Sam Moyn barely needs an introduction, but I will nevertheless offer one. He is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School, and he's also a Professor of History at Yale University. He has written several books in the fields of European history, and human rights history, of course starting with the last utopia, Human Rights in History, and his most recent book is Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. This morning, Professor Moyn will be discussing sufficiency, equality, and human rights. That, of course, to those of you familiar, to those of you who are not, draws from his 2018 book, Not Enough: Human Rights in an Unequal World. Sam will be speaking roughly for 30 minutes, and then we will have the second speaker. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a wonderful privilege to be introduced by you, which I didn't know it would happen, but it's great. And thanks to Leighton and to the organizers more generally. I've kind of lost the thread if this is still a conference kind of marking the anniversary of the school. Congratulations. As was said, I'm going to talk through, my current understanding of the argument I've been making about human rights and inequality, which is cast historically, but is supposed to have contemporary consequences. And I'll go through it and would love engagement from whatever angle. So to that end, I'm going to share my screen, which I believe should work, and enlarge my slides, and hopefully you can see them. This is the work I've done that bears on the conference theme, and it's a general consideration of how to think about the relationship between human rights and egalitarianism, especially distributive egalitarianism in modern history. So I begin with, a story about a Czechoslovak dissident, ZDENA TOMINOVÁ, who was the spokesperson of Charter 77, one of the first kind of widely recognized and self-styled international human rights outfits. And for her troubles agitating against the communist regime in her country in the 1970s, she had her head pounded into the pavement. She was asked to leave in what became a permanent exile. And I like to begin, this talk with her own lecture a few years after that in Ireland, where she surprised her listeners. She, of course, defended human rights advocacy and noted the importance of human rights law. Socialism of the kind that her country's regime had offered her could not be an alibi or excuse for disregarding human rights. But she said the reverse also ought to be true. Human rights couldn't be an alibi or excuse for abandoning socialism. And indeed, she waxed nostalgic about her youth in the 1940s, at the time of what we call the Czech coup, when the new regime engaged in class leveling and deprivileged the rich relative to the rest, and hoped that the new emphasis that she was championing on human rights wouldn't displace that goal, but would accompany it in a fusion of human rights and socialism. But of course, we know that didn't happen. And in fact, in all languages that Google's Ngram allows us to test, which is a lot, but surely not universal, the same pattern appears through the 20th century. Socialism is more frequently on people's tongues, far more salient in political debate, until something happens to it in the middle of the 1970s, when it begins to crater or tank. And astonishingly, the same inflection point is found in the phrase human rights. And interestingly, even in languages where there's no real novelty in trying to demasculinize the phrase, like droit de l'homme in France, which enjoys a similar meteoric rise just at this inflection point. And of course, the lines cross very illustratively in 1989. Now, of course, this data stops at a certain point. It doesn't include our time, which has seen a certain renaissance of socialism. But nonetheless, it's remarkable that TOMINOVÁ's hopes were, at least for the moment, for the 50 years since, shattered. And what I wanted to think about was whether it had to be that way, and how we might at least get a description going about the relationship between human rights and the political economy that has prevailed in the age of their ideological ascent. So to do that, I'm, going to tell a simplified story across modern transatlantic history, especially, with a couple of global remarks in three stages. First, roughly the 19th century. Second, the middle of the 20th century, which I'll associate with a consecration of welfare states. And then finally, our time, the time of so-called neoliberalism. So to make this story work, I had to make one more remark, which is in the title, and which I've thought a fair bit about even since writing the book that Professor Tzouvala mentioned. It's the distinction between our possible moral commitments to two different distributive ideals, one distributive sufficiency and the other distributive equality. Sufficiency calls for, if we accept it, some threshold when it comes to the distribution of the good things in life, and or monetized, if you are interested in doing so. And the basic moral idea is that everyone is entitled, or ought to be entitled, from their state or community to enough of the good things in life. And if you say that's your exclusive distributive obligation, then you're what we now call a sufficientarian. And I believe the first that I've located in the Western annals that I know most about is Thomas Paine, who says, I don't care how rich the rich are if the poor are taken out of poverty. And of course, that position is advocated even today, and is probably very widely held, at least in, let's call it, bien-pensant circles. Of course, some people don't even believe that sufficiency is of moral significance. But I want to contrast that commitment to some threshold conception of what our duty requires to an egalitarian conception, which concerns the entire distributional picture. For the egalitarian, it would or should matter that the rich get rich, even if the poor also do better or are brought above some line of subsistence or sufficiency, however generously we might define it. And I want to use this contrast to think about the three stages and say more about it as the talk unfolds. So I'll start with a very simple-minded notion about 19th century capitalism, which is that neither of these distributive ideals was protected in law, even on paper. And when indeed the most powerful human rights movement, especially when it came to enforcement by judges across the North Atlantic and beyond, concerned the protection of freedom of contract and the sanctity of private property. I mean, I think essentially looking at the actual legal history of the period, it was completely right for Karl Marx to infer that human rights didn't represent the interests of all, but of some, and in particular, the rising bourgeoisie, whom this human rights movement represented. And let's just bottom line the results by saying that a lot of people were beneath any credible threshold that we might think is morally significant, especially as people are, in urbanization, thrown off land into very precarious circumstances in the new industrializing economy. And of course, this century is the greatest of the expansion of class inequality, as well as global inequality to date. So that's a kind of baseline for how the politics of rights got caught up in a political economy in which neither insufficiency nor inequality was really kind of addressed by rights movements, let alone by kind of any legal orders that were constructed. That changed to some extent in the middle of the 20th century in the second stage. And what I basically want to claim, generalizing, wildly, is that the coming of welfare states in different versions, including communist and fascist versions, did try to institutionalize in law both sufficient provision and egalitarian distribution to some extent, different ones in different places. Now, it should be noted that this was always for the sake of a highly exclusionary national community, even or especially for imperial states in which welfare was developed in metropolitan spaces from which imperial subjects were excluded and never brought to global governance in the international system. And of course, there were also, as historians have shown, internal exclusions, since welfare states were always gendered and in most cases, involved, internal differentiation along lines of race or other lines. And yet I want to suggest for the beneficiaries of the welfare state, thanks to the white male family wage and other, in policy interventions, there were steps taken to legalize the moral ideals of sufficient provision and egalitarian distribution. As you all know, having experienced the wave of Thomas Piketty's work, this was the period in some crucial jurisdictions in which there was more class equality achieved than before, and as we'll see, since. What I want to look at in this phase is what the significance of this new kind of state was for rights. Well, I think Marx's suspicion about the true function of rights died hard, and maybe correctly. And you see even a liberal like John Hobson could say it's very out of fashion to attempt to envision social reform in terms of rights. And I actually think this lasted through much of the 20th century. And I think most of the rhetorics and legal bases of the kinds of innovations to which I've referred were not cast in terms of individual rights protection. However, it is true that on the basis of much more modest inventions of economic and social rights in the prior century, driven chiefly by labor movement, socialist parties, sometimes right-wing welfare states, as in Bismarck, Germany, there was a certain consecration of economic and social rights to kind of answer the Marxist charge. And these, as you know, involved things like the right to work, workplace protection, at their most aggressive and radical, not always honored in some of these new constitutions, and eventually the Universal Declaration, not just the right to organize, but also the right to strike. This is significant because it forces us to tether the history of social rights to the rise of a welfare state that at once marginalized the whole plausibility of rights as a language of reform, while also transforming the accepted content, at least in an increasingly wide mainstream of what rights ought to protect. So I look carefully at one figure, certainly I believe the person who in English in this period thought most about economic and social rights, and that's the Cambridge-Donn sociologist T.H. Marshall. And the essential thing I want to take from Marshall is that he thought that this moment was not just about sufficient provision, even when social rights protected it in name. It was about building a floor for the worst off, as he put it. But the ambition of the welfare state was simultaneously to construct a ceiling on inequality. So it was about sufficient provision as a threshold for all, and distributive equality alongside it. And he thought, I think it's turned out wrongly, that it would likely be almost a necessary relationship, that providing sufficient access to or the good things in life would lead to a constriction on class inequality, since the rich would pay for the sufficient provision of the rest, and it would be almost like an automatic ceiling alongside the construction of the floor. Just briefly, I think I've advocated that we should reread the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 as just a charter for this larger political economy of national welfare, but I won't go into that. I also won't go into the kind of global scene. So far, when I've talked about inequality that was constrained, uniquely at this time of the welfare state compared to before and since, I haven't mentioned that this very era saw global inequality increase, not reverse. And indeed, I think scandalously, the decolonization of the world and the multiplication of states fourfold eventually, actually for the first 20 years after 1945, led to continuing increases in global inequality. And so I think it's very interesting that to then look at the legal agenda of the new states, which in national terms was to transplant and reproduce the welfare state locally, in which they hadn't been included in late empire. But they also worked hard on new global standards. It's undoubtedly true that the new states help make possible things like the Second Human Rights Covenant, but not because there was any expectation of its extraterritorial application and any global project of sufficient provision where, for example, rich states would be on the hook to vindicate the social rights of poor globally. Rather, as we know, culminating in the new international economic order proposals, it was the egalitarian moral obligation that the new states most hoped to see scaled up, transplanted into the global order. But of course, they were beaten or failed. We could debate, why that project shipwrecked. What succeeded the second stage, obviously, in our time has been neoliberalism. And I'm just going to be very brief and get into detail if people press me about how I think about the relationship between human rights and so-called neoliberalism, which has become hotly disputed in the literature. Some harder than I am on human rights, some more extenuating or softer. And I'll try to explain why I'm taking the position I do. So I want to begin taking that position by just mentioning a few facts about this third era, which seem to me to make it distinctive. First, human rights didn't revert to the form Marx criticized, in the sense that I believe it's very hard to think that human rights are just a mask for the interests of the bourgeoisie, and certainly not the kind of institutionally the defense merely of freedom of contract and sacrosanct property. Instead, they're what we all know them to be, some kind of reformist cause. It may be ineffective or unambitious, but it's focused on global civil liberties, and it eventually takes on even more ambitious distributive aims to add to the vocation of human rights earlier from the welfare era of trying to protect distributional entitlements within constitutional states. Second, and this I think is quite important, human rights have been connected to a far larger agenda of campaigning for what I'll call status equality. Now, all along, both at the national scale and at the global scale, I've been speaking of distributive equality, the distribution of the good things in life, if monetized income and wealth. And of course, we could think of equality in a different way in terms of how people are treated, especially if they're subordinated on the basis of the kinds of people they are, in particular, the kinds of bodies they have. So here I have in mind that the last 50 years have been the scene of absolutely unprecedented drives to abolish the ongoing subordination of peoples that have occurred on the basis of gender, race, disability, indigeneity, sexual orientation. And it's obvious that anti-discrimination norms in human rights law have been, directly, relevant to those campaigns, along with national discrimination law and large movements. And human rights, it seems to me, in this period, did set themselves the vocation of correcting some of the exclusions, the internal exclusions, at least, that I stressed in my comments on the mid-20th century welfare states. So that's significant as well. Third, although belatedly, human rights law and movements came to focus on distribution. I and others have argued that in the original era of transnational human rights activism in the 1970s, the focus was narrowly on civil liberties, as if the second half of the Universal Declaration had never existed. But as we know, especially after the Vienna Conference, and really thanks to pressure from the global South, human rights movements have belatedly and slowly taken on concern with distributive sufficiency, especially the economic and social rights that were always there in national constitutions from a certain point and in the Universal Declaration. All I want to stress is that, as far as I can tell, human rights law doesn't say anything about distributive equality as opposed to sufficiency, and movements generally have ignored it. That doesn't need to be universally true, just mostly true, as I think it is. And I want to use that really distinctive fact, not to trivialize the others, but to help put human rights in our era. So I want to stake out an ecological view that if we're interested in why the age of human rights is the age of the victory of the rich in many countries and the increase in inequality, it's that they're unthreatening to that outcome. If you like, they're half Marshallian. They focus on, at best, when they intrude into distributive politics, on the construction of floors of protection. But it turns out that that doesn't automatically provide more egalitarian outcomes. And human rights law hasn't promised them, and human rights movements in general haven't striven to produce them. And so it's as if there's parallel play. Human rights are working on something that turns out to be, in many cases at least, relatively less threatening to what neoliberals have most wanted to achieve, which is increasing or exacerbated class inequality. I don't have time to spell out this argument or substantiate it. Not that I would, with many hours or, one book or many books, because one would have to look across time, across national settings, from Chile in 1973 to Anglo-America around the turn of the 80s, to the shock therapy and conversion of Eastern Europe, to the new economy after 1989, to places like China and India and their turn to marketization before and since. And having done that, one would also have to investigate international financial institutions and in their role. All I want to argue, my central argument, is that our age has been the age of what you might call Marshall's nightmare. I don't at all mean to deny the continuation of insufficiency, but compared to the first two eras I addressed, our era has been uniquely one of the extraordinary, if inadequate and spotty, remediation of poverty. And so some kind of built floor, whether or not achieved by aiming at rights per se or through the agency of rights movements and law, but it's also been the period of the obliteration of any ceiling on inequality within most settings. So to me, the signature is most clearly illustrated in the case of China, which has seen the remediation of poverty on a scale, that's almost unimaginable, acknowledging that it's merely the remediation of so-called extreme poverty, as the World Bank defines it. And that's come simultaneously with the greatest and most rapid increase in inequality in world history. And these things go together. Human rights bear on the one, even if they're not responsible for achieving poverty remediation. They provide normative standards for thinking about it. Human rights have had nothing to say about the other, the explosion in inequality, and have not even allowed, I think, conceptualizing it, except in terms of its potentially indirect harms for human rights enjoyment. So just to conclude, I'm for human rights, and I think there are crucial standards. Never have thought otherwise. I certainly don't want to scapegoat them for neoliberalism, to which I think they contributed very little. But they have limits in the face of neoliberalism as a framework of reform. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be defended, but it does mean that they should be kept or put in their place. And I'll just close by suggesting that if this is plausible, it doesn't just have to be because you accept the moral significance of egalitarian justice, although I personally do. You might be a sufficientarian and still think we need to supplement in practice our concern with sufficiency, just because it seems as if we've learned in many national settings that human rights, even just basic civil liberties, seem to be hostage to the roiling politics that accompany increasing inequality. And just on instrumental grounds, if not intrinsic ones, it may turn out that the fate of human rights depend on more egalitarian movements than we have seen, at least in the last several decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam.